Oh yeah, this is the alt Farbranch escape and answer camp women.
What was originally intended is Viola really is being offered up as some
As
kind
a
of
diversion,
decoy.
yeah. We had a longer version of the scene inside the barn where Viola actually volunteers to go out there with Ben.
Right, yeah, there was versions of the scene where she took charge and said, I'll do it, or I'll go, or something like that, which is an interesting, in a vacuum, like that's a really interesting thing for her character to do that, you know, and to...
But there was no actual plot reason for her to be doing it.
Right, exactly.
Like, yeah, it's like noble. Like, yeah, everybody who doesn't like a hero making a sacrifice, but...
Yep, and that's sort of where it ended.
And that's when I talk about the film being broken. Like, you have these things where you have great moments, but the structure's rotten. So, like, we're putting beautiful paint on it, but structurally it's not making any sense. In order to understand this sequence, you have to understand that there's sort of a half-working drone that's on the pad here that we would have seen earlier in Farbranch with the men trying to fix. Oh, actually, there's some post-viz of it. So Todd's heading towards the drone, and he's hidden by it. And then he would have turned it on. You know, it's attached to the ground by a chain. So this is all stuff that would have been set up earlier, and he's using it as a diversion so they can escape. And again, this started as they were going to ride the drone away from Farbranch, and then eventually was going to crash in the woods far away. But the drone was a setup to do like a really big, fun escape sequence from Farbranch, but we ultimately couldn't afford it, which is how we ended up with the idea of the thing just sort of rummaging around on the ground. It's not the most clever escape. This is, again, something great that can happen when an editor comes in with fresh eyes and ideas, is that Doc one day came in and said, I want to show you something, and had mocked up what you actually see in the movie that didn't actually take any additional photography. He did it all with visual effects, which was that Viola doesn't actually come out. It's an illusion of Viola.
We didn't shoot anything for that. Some of the additional photography of them running out of the barn we used, but that was a whole repurpose. So Todd sliding out of the door, we have wiped Viola out of that with visual effects. That was originally both of them escaping, and that was for a whole different version that we shot during additional photography that we ended up not using.
Because that's the other thing. It was hard enough not having a script and the issue that posed and figuring out these creative things. But also, you know, movies take place in the real world with real issues. The weather doesn't cooperate. You know, you can lose locations. In this case, we actually had come up with a new vision for how to get out of Farbranch, and that involves some new photography with Damien Bashir, and because of some issues, Damien could not come back for additional photography in the window that we had Todd and Viola, and so we actually had script pages we all really liked, but we couldn't shoot them. And that's when Doc came in with this idea of repurposing footage where Damien helps them escape by conjuring Viola. And that, I think it's a great insight into how an editor can come into a broken movie and see ways to repurpose scenes and make them work.
And of course, we see an omitted scene from the original photography where the mayor actually kills Ben instead of Ben being part of the third act.
For anyone who's read the full trilogy of books, I tried my best, and as did the studio, I'm sure, to make sure that any way that we killed Ben didn't feel too complete and final.
Well, you see him sort of wake up afterwards. I don't know if you kept that, but we had a little moment where you're like, maybe he's going to survive.
Going back for a second to the Viola noise illusion, I think also what was so wonderful about what Doc did in that moment is that he brought it back to noise again, and instead of it being an action sequence, which looked cool in concept and would have been fun, but actually he was able to take a moment there and make it about the power that noise can have, and make it a really heroic moment for Ben as well, which was a really nice thing. So we ended up with something very strong.
Yeah, and I think, too, once we had an ending on its feet, or versions of something similar to the ending that is currently in the movie, once we ended up in a place where Todd was going to create a whole bunch of things in his noise, it also became a necessity that we couldn't just pull that out of nowhere. Like, there had to be other moments in the movie where we saw either Todd or other characters do some pretty interesting and big things with their noise, so that we didn't feel like we were just at the 90-minute mark coming up with a cheat that wasn't true to the previous 90 minutes of the movie. And I think, like, This, I think, though it was never intended to be that way, the noise kiss is another moment that sort of fits with that. And then also when Todd has his breakdown after the journal scene, getting a handful of those moments where we see characters having a lot going on in their noise allowed us to get to a place at the end where it felt true to the rules that we had set up.
This was a nice conversation between them where they were able to actually take a moment to get to know each other better without it feeling like it slowed the film down because they were still on the move. So it was a sad byproduct of losing the wolf stuff. It was another card that fell from our house of cards, losing this moment of connection between them.
Once killed all our crops, but it's about 10 years ago, so you don't have to worry about that anytime soon.
We're getting to a section of the movie that was a big chunk that I believe is a large component of at least one of the books, but ultimately had no place in the final version for us.
In later books, it starts to become kind of a civil war between men and women.
Yep, that's the majority of the second book, called The Ask and the Answer. The answer is the women.
And I thought, that's an interesting place to take these two characters, is to start a war between the Prenticetown men and a group of women and put Daisy and Tom in the middle of that and test their allegiance to each other versus their allegiance to their sex. And so again, these are interesting ideas. Normally this would be happening long before you start shooting the movie, and you'd sort of get to the place of having an ending that would work with it. In this case, we literally were writing, the night before we would be shooting. So, just hearing it out loud now, it's a cool idea that there's going to become a civil war between the men and the women. It makes sense if the men killed a bunch of women in the past, that the women would want their revenge, and that's the finale would be a battle between men and women, and you put Tom and Daisy in the middle of that.
And these were women who escaped Prenticetown instead of being killed like the rest. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so that they have some history with Tom's mother, and so that they have history of Prentice and a reason to extract revenge. We decided to make them kind of highway bandits.
They'd withdrawn, from normal society. They obviously didn't want to live near or with any men. Doug, do you want to then talk about why we ended up not using this?
Well, once we finished with the initial photography and we were starting to figure out, additional photography, the main thing we were going to be focusing on is how do we end this story? And do we do the Civil War battle between men and women? And we ultimately decided not to do that. And once you're not doing that, then what's the point of taking all the time to set up this army of women? Because you got nowhere to go. There's sort of a rule in movies that scenes need to be essential for the third act to work. Like if the third act can work without a particular scene, then that scene probably has no business being in the movie. And obviously if the third act was going to be a battle between men and women, then these scenes would be essential. And some of these decisions get made sort of for creative reasons when you're talking about how you're going to end the movie, and some of them are financial. I mean, usually it's a combination of the two, because you can come up with really, what would be a great way to end the movie, but then you budget it out and it's more than we have to spend. So then you got to try a different version. On top of all the technical, creative challenges of figuring out a movie, everything you do comes with a price tag, and you have to be able to afford it.
A contributing issue was that these characters weren't in the script when we went into production. We were adding these characters during filming, which meant they weren't getting the development and the attention that they needed to really do them justice. And part of that was because in the earlier scripts we were trying to stay close to and true to the first book. And then when we had these story problems, eventually we were saying, okay, well, what can we pull from the second book or third book to bring in to really make this work?
The actresses who came in to play the answer women, I mean, they tried their hardest, but I mean, we just had an impossible situation. Just to give you an example of that, in one of the scenes I was shooting with them, I asked Claudia, who really playing one of the leaders of the women, I said, do you have the latest pages? And she pulls out a piece of paper for the scene we're about to shoot. She pulls out this piece of paper and says, I got them right here. And I said, that's not the latest version of the scene. And I hadn't even looked at it. I just saw it in her hand. She goes, how do you know that? I said, because that piece of paper is folded over. Like, that clearly looks like it's been in your pocket because the latest scene we just printed like 10 seconds ago. So literally, I knew she didn't have the current pages because they were folded in half. So if you're writing stuff that close to shooting and you're going to try to create a character who can stand a chance of competing against Mads Mikkelsen, we had more time to develop, we were never going to be able to fully realize that. I said, we need to stop shooting and we need to spend time writing and developing these characters. And then by the time we did that in additional photography, there really wasn't going to be the money to do this giant epic war between the men and the women anyhow. So we had to just come up with a completely new idea.
And all of these supporting characters, while the plot lines were interesting and were adding a lot of dimensions to the story, it meant that sometimes we were losing sight of what was happening with Todd and Viola. And so we did end up stripping back a lot of the supporting plot lines that were happening just to keep it centered on Todd and Viola. And while it would have been interesting to explore a lot more about the dynamics of men and women, it was really that we wanted to be telling that story through Todd and Viola's eyes rather than looking at it with a much wider lens. This is actually one of my favourite shots in the film. I just love that rack focus in that moment where he appears.
We should talk about Aaron and his unique relationship to the noise and figuring out the look of his noise and the idea to make it look different from the other characters.
Aaron is going to kill a dog in this movie. That's about as extreme a thing as you could have a character do in a movie. Everything about Aaron was with that in mind, knowing that we had to create a character that wasn't just a homicidal maniac, that there was some rhyme or reason. Coming up with what's going on inside his head, you could look at this and be like, he's just a homicidal maniac, but the fact that we were going to get an insight into what he's thinking, the hope was that we could turn him into a three-dimensional character and specifically create the one character in Prentisstown who's actually torn up with guilt about what happened in the past, and that is in fact what is driving him.
We really don't learn or reveal that till right at the end, but up until that point, we know that he came to this planet as a preacher, so we know that he's zealous, and we know that there's scripture running through his head. We know that there's conflict. He talks a lot about judgment, thinks a lot about judgment. So we had all of these pieces that we wanted to play with, sin, sinner, and then we want that moment where he's confronting Violet at the end, where he reveals to her, I am the sinner. Actually, he's been struggling with guilt this whole time. And he realizes that he's the one that needs to pay. So yeah, we spent a lot of time working on that journey, trying to figure out the best way to have that journey make sense so that he is a villain, elicits the kind of fear that you want, as Doug says, here, on a three-dimensional character. So we hope we managed to pull that off. Working with David Oyelowo was an absolute pleasure for all of that. He comes with so much passion for the project that it was a real pleasure having those conversations with him.
Yeah.